Well, thank you all so much for your patience as we get everyone tuned in. We have a big audience today, excited to join us. We also have our translators joining us today. So if you are looking for any of your content to be translated into Spanish or Portuguese, that is an option for you. These sessions are being recorded, so we will have them for playback available to you within 2 weeks after the Congress. So it looks like we're ready to get started. I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share, and I'm going to turn it over to Amy and Kira to kick us off.
Perfect. So thanks, everyone. I'm super excited to introduce Dr. Hoffman today. Kira's from I think it's the Buckley Valley Research Institute. Is that correct?
It's the Bulkley, but we kind of refer to it as the Wet'suwet'en because that's the Wet'suwet'en name for the river instead of the Bulkley from a man who's never actually been here.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. We'll probably get into that in our sessions today about things like that. But yeah, so Kira's also a student at UBC, or not a student, a postdoc. And she also works with, we've worked together on quite a few projects that we have coming up. And I mean, one of Kira's most interesting pieces that I think she's published recently has been about Indigenous peoples' contributions to biodiversity around the world using fire. So I think she's going to expand on that a little bit more here. And yeah, I'm super excited to hear your talk, Kira.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll just start sharing my screen here.
Okay, I'll let you know if we see it or not.
Let's see. Okay. You see that?
Yes, yeah, it's perfect right now.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, well, thanks so much for everyone for having me. It's still dark where I am, so hopefully it's not too backlit here. But I'm very honored to be part of this special session and share some research with you today that's really been shaped by everyone who is presenting here. Many of the ideas and opportunities for me have been provided by inspirations from many of the papers and workshops that I've been in. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging my co-authors, so Dr. Amy Cardinal-Christianson, who you'll hear from right after me, as well as my colleagues from the University of Waterloo. So I'm gonna begin by just taking a moment to acknowledge how important Indigenous fire stewardship is. So this is from Lauren Marchland from Salix Nation in the Okanagan, and this piece is called "Fire is Everything Connected." And it really resonates with me because you can see that, you know, fire is being represented across the globe, but also locally in the species that we see. My children are hijacking my conversation. Honey, I'm giving a presentation. Okay. Oh, you get. Close the door. Close the door. Please.
We love kids. Don't worry. My kids are home too today because it's a snow day. So
I know we're like in the middle of an atmospheric river and trying to get my kids out the door to preschool.
No worries at all.
Okay. But I kind of want to, begin by just, you know, bringing in the sweetgrass, the braiding, the weaving, as well as just the interconnectedness of fire. So I have the opportunity to work across so many different disciplines, and they're all related to fire. But Indigenous fire stewardship is, you know, so important to how I perceive the landscape and how I'm able to learn about fire in these systems. So I'm not Indigenous, but many of the teachings that have been shared with me are from Indigenous fire practitioners and knowledge holders from several different communities, specifically the Wet'suwet'en and the Gitxsan, as well as the Heiltsuk and Wiikinuxw on the central coast of BC. I live in Smithers, which is in northern British Columbia, up kind of in here, in Gittinden House and Clan, which is Grizzly Bear. And British Columbia in Canada is incredibly diverse. It's home to 198 nations. And this is really, really important because Indigenous fire stewardship is very distinct to communities and nations. And you're going to hear about this a lot today. Again, it's grounded in intergenerational teachings. And it's used for many, many different reasons. across many different diverse biomes and ecosystem types. And I think one of the things that it has really in common is that it's almost always undertaken under low risk conditions. So whether that's at night, in the wet season, or when there's still snow on the ground. And one thing that really resonated with me from Dawn's talk was, of course, this idea of, it's a family practice, and often when cultural burns are taking place, there's children out there, and when they're overseen by wildfire management agencies, you get people coming in with heavy machinery, PPE, and they can be a little bit horrified when they see, children as young as 2 years old out there burning. In my experience, I've seen fire, in the neighboring community just down the road in Whitsett, and they burn every spring and fall. But also, part of my PhD has been looking at ancient fire practices, and in 2016, I was able to go out on a dig on Tricket Island, and it's one of the oldest village sites in North America, about 14,000 years old, and we found a fire drill that was 6,000 years old, and we replicated it to try and make fire ourselves. And after hours of trying to make fire, I realized that my experience as a firefighter putting fires out was probably impacting my ability to set fires. But it's also it's very challenging, especially when you're in coastal temperate rainforest where it's very wet. And it's incredibly humbling to see the advanced fire knowledge in many of these places. And I think that's kind of like the bottom line here is that Indigenous fire stewardship is thousands of years old, and it's a very healthy component of functioning ecosystems, be that in the Chilcotin, in the central interior British Columbia, or the Garry Oak Meadows of southern Vancouver Island. I think the Western world and Western perspectives to fire science are really beginning to wake up to a very different fire era, kind of this new mega fire area where we're getting into very severe and large wildfires, that are unprecedented, and they're unprecedented for many different reasons. But I think we're starting to realize that we can't really suppress these fires; they're uncontrollable. And 2021 was a great example of when we had fires that were very large and impacted many, many people around the world. And another 2-year-old. You know what, honey? You hop out the door, okay? Okay.
Mama.
Okay.
Mama.
Bye, guys.
Oh, okay. I think this just, this is life right now, but I'll just continue. So, in places like Lytton, BC, where we experienced really devastating wildfires and sadly 2 fatalities, we see that many communities, especially Indigenous communities, are really facing a lot of barriers to mitigate wildfire risk and undertake fire stewardship within their communities and across their broader territories. And so, last summer, there was just a lot of talk about how we need to get more fire on the land. We need to get more fire on the land. And that was coming from agencies, so provincial and federal governments, but also from communities. But there's just so much red tape to doing so. And I think there's also just this, people are really not acknowledging the fact that Indigenous people have not only the fire science expertise, the place-based knowledge, but also just this interconnectedness with their community in place. And so that acknowledging and valuing of that experience is not really happening. So there's a bit of a disconnect. And so when fires actually are being allowed to go ahead, cultural burns, a lot of it's for cleaning up or kind of getting rid of fuels, dealing with, artifacts of 100 years of fire suppression and fuel buildup, and less for medicine and foods and ceremonial purposes. We're often seeing kind of the 99th percentile conditions. You know, we had in the last 5 years, we've had 3 of the worst wildfire seasons on record in British Columbia. And so that's really in the rank 5 and 6, you know, but we could be in rank 1 and 2, rank 3 and 4, and just with supporting Indigenous-led cultural burning, because we just have more fire in the landscape, and it would slow down larger fires, and it would just really support greater biodiversity across our landscapes. And so what we've seen is a major erosion of biodiversity. And so when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about the severity, the frequency, the extent, the fire cycle that includes cultural and lightning ignitions. And, you know, where I live here in Northern British Columbia, we've had huge fires. You know, some of our fires are 500,000 hectares. They're really covering a lot of area. And, you know, when you couple that with large scale harvesting, so clear cut logging, and then, you know, salvage logging, and then replanting, you're really you're stripping away these landscapes. And you're really setting a timer for when these forests that are homogeneous and how they look and function, they're just kind of this next future disaster waiting to happen, because we're not doing things, listening to people who might want to do things a different way. And I think the thing for me is that a lot of the times when we consider pyrodiversity, we don't include human drivers of pyrodiversity. We don't look at cultural burning as a really integral to it. To me, it really directly shapes pyrodiversity because it controls when, where, how, why, and then it indirectly, you know, increases biodiversity, because then you get, you know, many plants that can occupy an ecosystem, many animals that can then eat those plants, and you get increased habitat heterogeneity. So my colleagues and I at the University of Waterloo wanted to look at relationships between Indigenous fire stewardship, so whether that's Swidden, slash and burn, mosaic burning, fire stick farming, all over the world, and see whether or not it eroded or benefited biodiversity measures. We reviewed about 900 articles, and we really tried to look at different research approaches. So not really focus on one area. We wanted to really focus on studies that were led by Indigenous fire practitioners, and there was actually quite a few of them in Australia, but also look at deep time, so paleoecological proxies, and all of them had to look at the direct relationship between cultural burning and biodiversity. And biodiversity was measured, you know, in alpha, beta, and gamma. We did find that almost 85% of studies reported increase in biodiversity as a result of Indigenous fire stewardship. And that was across, you know, woody vegetation, mammals, birds, even below ground soil processes. So that's being microbes. And of course, we looked across scales. And, you know, fire being used for many purposes is not going to come as a surprise for Indigenous fire practitioners and knowledge holders. But I think that kind of the thing that really surprised me, and Sally Archibald brought it up yesterday, was the commonalities in fire. And so you could have similar ways of burning in tropical or temperate rainforests as you do in the savanna, and similar reasons for burning. What Amy and I have collaborated on is a piece for Frontiers for Young Minds. So we've taken those results from the proceedings paper and turned them into kind of a more of accessible, what is Indigenous fire stewardship for children. And we had, you know, 7 to 12-year-olds peer review this journal or this article. And I have to tell you, if you ever want someone to poke holes in your science, just ask a 10-year-old. They'll be brutally honest. And it really helped, I think, me to understand Indigenous fire stewardship in a kind of a more deeper way. And so again, just kind of understanding that there's all these different ways of burning, all these multitudes of knowing and understanding fire. And again, what kind of stood out from the paper was that fire almost always occurred under these low risk conditions. Again, so when you could control it and understanding when fire might get out of control. And so again, take home message of this paper was that when people controlled fire, when they applied it often and when it was low in severity, it increased biodiversity and habitat heterogeneity. And that's across all of Earth's terrestrial biomes, except for the tundra, where there is fires, but not a lot of studies that have been done on it. So I think that, this kind of gets back to that beginning piece where fire is everything connected, because in my work, I see that fire is really connected to so many different aspects. People don't often relate fire to salmon or fire to berries or bears. And fire is this process that really impacts so many things. You think about ecosystem services, and when we support Indigenous led fire stewardship, there is many positive repercussions. So increases in biodiversity, increases in habitat heterogeneity. I'm going to be kind of showing some headlines that came out in 2021 and just kind of paint the picture of, if you're a child and your only experience with fire is seeing these news headlines or seeing fire on the news, it can be very scary. You see words like tragedy, ravage, destruction, and it can really shape the way that you perceive fire and have a relationship with fire. But 2021 also brought out some really important news stories. And again, this awareness of different kinds of fire. And so if you're a child and you're going out and you're burning with your family, or you're seeing this, or someone who is, can really change the way that you perceive fire. And I think it can really build a healthier relationship with fire, which in my opinion, we all need to have, because fire is not going away, but we do have the tools and the ability to learn about different ways of understanding and knowing fire. And the great thing is we can be doing it right now. So I'll just leave with this wonderful picture of Amy, which is taken by Amber Bracken. And I think we might have a few minutes for questions.
Thanks, Kara. Great talk. So Dawn, yeah, okay, there's Dawn. Perfect.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I think there's maybe one question kind of waiting in the wings here, Kira, and that was a fantastic presentation. I really loved learning about the work that you've been doing up there. One question that's from the audience is, how do the Indigenous people in the region burn for food? And so I guess if you had some comments on that.
Sure. So where I live, there's a lot of spring burning that occurs to increase fodder for game. So that's deer and moose. I'm kind of in the subboreal forest, and there's so many different ways of burning for food, and I'm not privy to all of them, of course. But another main burning practice is for huckleberries, and that often occurs in the fall, about every 5 years. It's just so amazing how many ways to burn a landscape. One that really surprised me was that in Whitsett, just down the road from where I live, they actually burn really early in the spring when there's still snow on the ground to increase the shrubs that are able to come up on the riverbed, and then that actually decreases flooding, which they've experienced in their communities. And so the water's sucked up. And for me, flooding and fire are always really a bad combination. But to think about fire to decrease flooding is just, it's really wonderful.
Great, thanks. I'm not seeing any further questions at this point, and I know we're just a few minutes behind on schedule. So I would encourage other folks who have questions for Kira to maybe directly contact her through Huva. And I really appreciate you contributing to this panel, though. I think that was fantastic, and I definitely want to learn more. So thank you.
Thank
Next
you.
up in our session is actually Amy Cardinal-Christianson, Métis Treaty 6, will be presenting on her work and updates from Canada. And Amy, I'll turn it over to you because I'm starting to lose my voice here for a second.
Yep, no worries. Here we go. Just share my screen here, and if something doesn't show up, just let me know.
Amy, we see it in presenter mode right now. Are you able to do full screen?
Yeah, 1 second here.
There, oops.
Sorry, I'm just, for some reason I have a lag on it. There we go. Can you see that?
We're seeing your view, not there you go. Perfect.
Okay, yeah, perfect. There's a bit of a lag there. So thanks. So I'm also have children at home. I'm in Treaty 6 territory right now, which is central Alberta, and we got a dump of snow last night. So you might hear children screaming in the background because our bus service was canceled. And I think that's one of the interesting things with this panel is that I think almost all of us are coming from very remote areas. But yeah, hopefully you'll be able to, they won't scream too loud. But so I'm Métis. I'm from Treaty 8 territory, from the Cardinal and Lebequin families. So Treaty 8 is Northern Alberta, and I grew up in the boreal forest. And as I said, I've moved down a bit southern, but I still work in the boreal a lot. And right now I'm a fire research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service. So I'm here to talk about a national Indigenous fire working group that we're starting in Canada. But I first just wanted to give a little bit of context to why this is important. There we go. So for me, as I said, growing up in the boreal, a lot of people in Canada see it more as a resource, but for us, for Indigenous peoples, Métis and others, you know, it's a cultural landscape that has supported our nation since time immemorial. And Indigenous fire knowledge is not singular, but it's plural, as Kira said, and deeply connected to place. So in Canada, you can have neighboring nations that burn for completely different reasons, depending on what their cultural values are. And so Indigenous nations hold significant knowledge in Canada about fire-driven landscapes. And I haven't yet met a nation that doesn't have a set of practices and relationships with landscapes that burn here. In the Eastern Canada, because there's a longer history of colonization there, many people don't remember burning practices in their community. But there is starting to be more evidence in physical science or Western science. And also, if we look back at historic accounts of you know, fires that used to happen, and a great example of that is in Labrador, where there's a lot of recent research coming out about fire use there by Indigenous peoples. And so I want to say to you, for us, like, fire is not just fire. Lots of times, especially in my role with the government, people just talk about fire like it's something you can kind of just pick up and leave. But for us, it's not. It's a part of who we are. It's a part of who our nations are, and vital to our communities in terms of, you know, physical and mental health, cultural health, well-being of community. And just to note too that wildfires are important too. There's reasons, you know, that you know, there's basically things also of value that we get from wildfires, but because of the mosaic that we were able to put on the landscape with the help of wildfires in the north, we didn't get the current situation that we're seeing now. And so that's a picture of my daughters burning this spring. So that's 2 and 5 years old out there on the landscape, learning to respect fire and why it's important. And you can see the snow in the background there as well. So as Kira mentioned so greatly, Indigenous knowledge systems a lot is coming out now, especially in the scientific literature, about how our knowledge systems can steward biodiversity. And one of those is that publication that Kira mentioned, some others there as well. And Indigenous knowledge systems can also provide nature-based solutions to climate change. So as Kira was saying about, flood prevention measures, or, preventing massive smoke emissions during the summer from putting mosaic on the landscape too. And so in Canada, what we went through was basically what I always refer to as a cultural severance activity. And it was explained to me by my colleague, Dr. Faisal Mullah, where, for Indigenous people, we had this history of being on the land. And all of a sudden, when settlers came, not only did, they take our children and take them to residential school, they also took us off of the land. They put our ancestors in communities or reserves where they weren't allowed to leave without a pass. They were told that they couldn't use fire, or they would face penalty of fines or jail in Canada. And so it was just a really difficult and hard time. And I think that what people don't understand is the impacts that has on you as a person and on, your pride in your nation, in your culture. And it leads to the intergenerational trauma that we see today. And so, some of the art that I'm showing throughout this are from the Blazing the Trail, Celebrating Indigenous Fire Stewardship booklet from Fire Smart Canada that we put together if you're interested. So we have a wildland fire evacuation database at the Canadian Forest Service that tracks all evacuation orders in Canada from 1980 to 2021 that are associated with wildfire. And so, we always have evacuations. You can see a little bit of a trend upwards, but sometimes it's a bit hard to know because we have, is there increased media reporting on evacuation events or agencies tracking these events better? Why are we seeing this increase? It's a bit hard to tell, but just since 2010, you can really see that we're getting kind of an upswing in some of these evacuations. And 2021 for us was just off the charts in Canada. We had multiple provinces that were impacted by evacuations, which was devastating to many communities this summer. And then now we're seeing more flood evacuations in the same communities in British Columbia, which is just horrible. So looking at a map across Canada, this shows that the number of evacuees by the size of the dot. So smaller evacuations are obviously smaller dots to larger dots. So you can see all throughout the Boreal, we've had evacuations. The interior of BC is just crazy with the number of evacuations, and probably associated there with a very high density of people living in that region. But in the kind of north in the Boreal, most of those communities are Indigenous communities, and we have a graphic of that coming up. And so one important thing to point out is that for our recordings, about 48% of evacuations in Canada have been of communities with greater than 50% Indigenous population, but Indigenous peoples only make up about 5% of the population in Canada. And many of those people, Indigenous people now actually live in urban settings. So the disproportionate impact on Indigenous peoples who live in more rural settings or on reserves has been huge in Canada. So if we just look at, in particular at BC, so this is the number of wildfire evacuees. So people who've been evacuated for fire in 2003, that was when the communities of Kelowna and Barriere were evacuated. And Kelowna has a high population, which is why we see that big spike there when some of the community was evacuated. But again, in 2021, we see another spike there, just showing how many people were evacuated. And then looking at number of wildfire evacuation events in British Columbia. So again, these are evacuation orders. We can see this just increase as we go from about 2003 onward to just, we're getting more years with a lot of evacuation events. So this is from 2021, looking again at locations of evacuations. So smaller dots, smaller evacuations to larger events. And the orange dots are Indigenous communities and yellow or non-Indigenous. So in British Columbia, it's a bit of a mix of Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities getting evacuated, but Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, almost all the communities there that are being evacuated from wildfire are Indigenous. So when we look at some of this is from a project we have with the Department of National Defense in Canada. So this is looking at communities that need air support in Canada to be evacuated, so they do not have road access. So yeah, they have to basically bring in Hercules aircraft or helicopters or other things to be able to get people out of harm's way. And again, these are all Indigenous communities just kind of spread throughout the boreal forest that are really at extreme risk to wildfire. So I think, what we want to see as Indigenous peoples is this reunion with fire. We've basically been excluded from fire management in Canada in higher up decision-making positions. And I think Indigenous people want to get back where we're seeing our practices on the landscape and basically improving ecosystem health, but at the same time, protecting communities and protecting our nations. So like, as Kira was talking, there's so many great reasons about why we should put Indigenous fire back on the landscape. So why aren't we doing it? Well, in Canada, there's a very low recognition of Indigenous expertise related to fire. This whole issue of, who the expert is. So if you come out with a university degree, you're immediately an expert on fire. Whereas if you have been in your community 20 years, but don't have high school, you're basically considered a non-expert. There's also a lot of power dynamics at play when we talk about fire and returning fire to the landscape. We're talking not just about that, we're talking about big issues. Who owns the land, Indigenous sovereignty, like respecting us as nations, the land back movement. And so that immediately makes the issues much bigger. There's also massive amounts of money in Canada spent on wildfire management, but none on us. So there's no sustained funding really or jobs for Indigenous people. Many of our Indigenous firefighters are on basically emergency crews or contract crews where they get very limited time on the fire line. And then, we get a lot of one-off projects. So, people or researchers that come in that want to do one burn or something like that. And there's overwhelming requests right now because of the non-Indigenous interest in cultural burning practices. And we hear these words all the time, like capturing Indigenous knowledge, integrating Indigenous knowledge, learning from Indigenous knowledge keepers, but nothing really about, putting those people who have that knowledge into positions of power where they're the ones making the decisions. So to me, it comes down to a social justice issue. And at the bottom there's the Good Fire podcast. If you're interested, Frank and Dawn and others have been guests on it, and it kind of looks at these issues in more depth. So let me just look at my time here. Okay, so the National Indigenous Fire Working Group basically came from a recommendation from the Blueprint for Wildland Fire Science in Canada. And I will admit that I wrote that section, and it was with my colleague Stacy Sankey, and it was based on the 15 years of research that I've done across Canada and just hearing from communities, that they really want to be able to push policy and fire management at Canada at a higher level. And so we got funding from the Emergency Management Strategy through Natural Resources Canada to be able to do this work. But one of the things that we had was that, so I thought this was a good idea, NRCan thought it was a good idea, but did Indigenous people think it was a good idea? So our first step was to host 4 engagement sessions with 46 Indigenous fire experts from across Canada. So we did that in June and July. We had 4 sessions, 3 in English and 1 in French, and also made different basically accommodations for people who wanted to speak in their Indigenous language. And we were really asking basic questions. Do we want a working group? And what the heck is this working group going to do? And so the report was by Cambium Indigenous Professional Services, and the cover's on the right there. So I'm just going to very quickly go through the overview. So one of the most important things here was that we had an engagement participation matrix. So we wanted to ensure that we, weren't just representing one group. We get a lot of interest in BC on this topic. So there's a lot of people from BC that want to attend, but like, what about Atlantic Canada, Quebec, and other places? So we really want to make sure, we had key qualities, different heritage groups. So First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, geographic representation, gender and diversity. Also, what were those people doing in their community? We didn't just want a whole room full of chiefs and councillors. We wanted people who were actually out on the landscape. So yeah, I think we did a really good job at trying to cover a bunch of things. So for the working group needs and desires, so there's, the engagement session showed that there's varying levels of Indigenous knowledge and multiple nations that want to be in this space to ensure that there's capacity building and networking opportunities. It was also very important to them that we had spaces for youth to elders on this group, so that it wasn't just a typical, middle-aged kind of professional group, but a space for a bunch of different people to come together and safely talk about Indigenous knowledge. And one thing was that many of the regions were quite concerned. They wanted to make sure that their voices were represented at the table too. So, that everyone just didn't hear from folks in BC, like I said, or in the West that are more interested. And they wanted also to make sure in meetings that people were given time to talk and to discuss. So important considerations that they wanted when we do this working group is that the most important thing was they wanted a protocol developed for the sharing of Indigenous knowledge and protocols for the protection of Indigenous knowledge, including giving credit where credit is due. There's lots of, like I said, in Canada, agencies now that want to collect Indigenous knowledge. So, they thought that this group could be something where we make a stand on protecting our nations. And, identifying the actions and goals, establishing a clear structure, and ensuring that the working group is not doing something that's already being done, undermining existing operations, or impeding on previous existing relationships that others have. So they really wanted it to be more of an advisory or national body and not something that, told people in their communities what to do. So a big discussion too was on what should the role of NRCan or government agencies be in this group? And, there was a lot of talk about this. And I put this picture, these are pictures from my trail cam on my property on my burn, but this is what Indigenous people usually do when government people come into the room, is kind of run away or don't talk. If you ever go to a meeting about Indigenous burning, the second government folks leave the room, that's when all the really good discussion comes out. So, they thought that the most important role was that they fund the group and then it be necessary and sustainable. And they were very concerned that the government might interfere with knowledge sharing activities, speak over people, or, put their political agendas on the role of the working group. So the overall end goals of the working group are to understand why and when to introduce wildfire, resolve systemic problems within Canadian wildfire management, identify issues and provide recommendations, creating standards of practice, helping to distribute and disseminate information about Indigenous knowledge, and then empower communities to be more resilient. So the next step for this group is actually to form a steering committee of 4 to 5 people who will be paid positions, who will develop the terms of reference for the working group. So, that'll be the vision of the working group, who sits on it, how many seats are they appointed, elected, all of those fun things, when you're trying to form a board. So yeah, that's the end from me. If anybody has any questions, sorry, Dawn, hopefully I didn't go over time. They need to really put a thing on Zoom where you can see your time.
I think you did great. You're right there. And
Okay.
yeah, I think, Amy, that was fantastic. I really enjoyed learning more about what you've been up to, despite you and I being in contact a lot.
Yeah, and I meant to say too on my one slide too that this comes, from what I've observed with you guys in California and the FireSticks Alliance in Australia and some of the other things that are going on where Indigenous people are really coming together And yeah, I feel like we need to do that in Canada too.
Yeah, no, I think that was great, and I think this whole session is really focused on kind of bringing out the things that we're doing that are in common and learning from each other, and hopefully I'm seeing so many people in the room here. We've got 64 participants, and I just think it's fantastic that we've got people maybe from different areas of the world that we're not connected with, and so how can we help each other out? And that's fantastic. And great, your kids, pop in too.
Yeah, I hear them now jumping upstairs.
Yeah.
So
That's fantastic. We're all, as I told Amy last night, we're all family oriented. So this is typical for us, right? I wanted to, I guess, get to a couple of the questions in the chat. One of them is kind of focused on this idea, and you kind of get to it in your presentation, but I think it's really suiting for you. It's from a person who works for the U.S. government and tries to engage with tribes. But any suggestions on how to be more effective and respectful in building meaningful relationships among tribes and so forth?
yeah, so I think it's a bit hard for me to answer, just because like I say, like when I go to work with communities, like the communities that I work with, I'm related to most of them. So like I kind of have like a little bit of an easy in there, which I'll totally admit. But I think one of the things like that I'm seeing in a lot of communities is this whole idea of like collecting knowledge for the government. And I think what we really want to see in the communities is instead being empowered to make decisions on our own territories. So, if somebody comes in that really wants to elevate Indigenous people, so hire Indigenous people, and not just in token roles, but to make decisions about what's happening in their community, I think that those are widely accepted. And another thing too is that you have to kind of come in with money. I hate putting it on that, but many Indigenous communities are underfunded. In Canada, it's just ridiculous. So most people wear multiple hats in the community and are very overcommitted. They're the fire chief, the community nurse, a counselor, like just on one person. So we basically need money to be able to hire people to meet you where you are as a paid salary position.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and I appreciate you sharing that. I'll also talk about it when I get to my presentation later, but that's fantastic. There was another question, or also on the side, and I don't know if it was for you or Kira's presentation, but I think that there's also kind of this interesting comment which is kind of why I want to bring it up, is thinking about kind of the news depiction of fires, and this person's referencing the boreal forest in their comment, but it says beyond, favorable news articles, how else do you think the ecological aesthetic benefits of fire should be introduced to the general public and that would not commonly interact with or think about wildfire?
Yeah, so one thing that we often see is like the demonstration sites again, but that's more local, like more localized. So you have to kind of be driving through an area to be able to do it. I think that for me, the FireSticks Alliance in Australia has done a fantastic job at this and getting this out. And I think with them, they've been able, because they're funded, to be able to get out in the community. So to different community events. They host a bunch of different workshops. They host like their national Indigenous cultural burning event, I think, Dawn, right? Where they get over 400 participants sometimes to it out on the land, who, then those people can go back and take that message of good fire into their communities. So I think that they have just, done a great job in trying to get that message out. We tried in Canada we've tried with the Good Fire podcast, with the Blazing the Trail booklet, but the one thing that I worry about is just that appropriation of knowledge. We get a lot of now non-Indigenous interests, like I said, in cultural burning, and people who want to come and understand our practices. Whereas, that's not really the role for me for allies. And I think that Mary is going to get into this a lot. So I won't go further into it because I could rant all day. Dawn knows.
we all can, right? We can talk this all the time. So yeah, I think there's one comment, somebody's saying, really excited to hear about the Good Fire podcast season 2. And thanks for the talk. I think that's fantastic. And so looking forward to that, because I think it's really important for us all to be sharing our stories.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. So I think if there are other questions for Amy, obviously reach out via the chat and Huva, or email her, whatever, or contact me, however you want to do that. I'm happy to forward stuff on to Amy as well. But thanks, Amy, for your contributions on this.
Yeah, thanks, Don.
Our next presenter, Victor Stephenson, I don't believe is in the audience. I'm looking.
I don't see him either, Don.
Okay, perfect. So the backup plan that we have is to play a video that that was filmed last year. So actually, it would have been a year ago this week. And Amy and I both actually participated in this workshop that the FireSticks Alliance hosted in Australia. But the intent of what Victor was going to share with us, and I'm keeping in mind that it's like 2:40 or so in the morning in Eastern Australia, so that could be why he's not with us. But the intent of what Victor was going to share was this idea of building what do you want to say, like certification programs and training programs for Indigenous peoples. And in Amy's presentation, she shared this idea of the Indigenous fire workshops and how it brings together people to learn about fire, and it's pretty comprehensive. So I'll let this video play. It's not obviously it's not the the same as having Victor here in person, but it'll at least give a sense of some of the work that's taking place with the FireSticks Alliance in Australia, and then we can continue on with our presentations after that. So I'll let.
It looks like we only have about 10 minutes worth of his presentation time. What time of this video do you want to start playing from? Same spot and just play the 10 minutes of it, or do you want me to advance to the last 10 minutes?
I'm thinking that maybe the last 10 minutes might be good from it. Yeah, and I'll just give some context. So at the workshop, and Amy, if you remember, you can add on this too, but at the workshop, they were kind of unrolling this idea of sharing or developing a certification type program, and discussions around how do you engage Indigenous community in monitoring and qualification systems and so forth, and what does that look like. And so I think what I'm hoping to be able to share with this Vimeo project, and I'll put this in the or maybe I don't know, we'll figure out a way to get the link to you all. Maybe I'll post it on.
I'll drop it for you in the chat. Yeah.
Perfect. But yeah, we can. It's available on Vimeo. You can watch the whole thing there. But yeah, I think it's really focused on how to get people past this barrier of qualifications and recognition. And so I think the take home is that it takes a while to get there. So all right, so here's the video, and I'm going to stop sharing my video and mic right now.
You're on mute. Yeah.
Thanks, Baz. Yeah, so over the past year, we've been working on the Fulcrum forms and connecting the knowledge map up, working with Jabbergai community, Gabby, Dingy. We've visited Tasmania and also parts of Victoria. Unfortunately, then had to go home from COVID, but we've shared that up with mobs on the ground as well to trial and use. So we've been improving those tools. Also the seasonal calendar work, which Jess spoke about, the really importance of those calendars, but also, how that relates to kind of site-specific indicators and what goes on there, and really needs to be recorded, because every, as you're moving through vegetation, even the same vegetation types, those indicators are slightly later. So working to refine those tools, and that's something that we want to continue to do, but through that, working with the mob on the ground and what they really need for those apps. And that's what we've been doing, is sort of modifying those as we go for different groups. Also, the social and, emotional outcomes from the work as well, and sort of building in and documenting that. So eventually we'd like to make them a lot more fancy, I suppose, and interactive. And there's some of the sessions we've been having with universities, and how do we support in the right way people doing the right thing, working with the mob, with their own methodology and the things that they're driving in that space. And really just as we need 1,000 more practitioners, we also need those researchers and those monitoring and documenting and going into those career pathways as well. So that's really what it's about. It's about getting the mob leading that research and their protocols around that, because there's so much interest in the space. And you know, I've been fortunate enough to be working with Jabbergaw on those research protocols around particularly threatened species, but more generally. So yeah, it's sort of, that's the, you know, what, like Vic said, what is needed and what is the support. People have experienced that at the national workshop, and they've experienced it in different ways with country visits and programs and pilots. So we really just, you know, I've heard this morning Tassie talking about, you know, the importance of cultural heritage in Far North Queensland, and, you know, being able to document sites as part of the process, and sort of, you know, what other things are needed, particularly with animal removal, where mob might be faced with wildfire events where, you know, their species are being impacted upon. So we really want everyone to know input, like into how it can improve, and also what resources are needed. So, you know, what do you have now, and how can we build on that? So for yourselves, how do you want to build on that? And this information then will help inform, you know, that investment pathway for funders and investors that we've been speaking to actually help support those programs on the ground. And that's, you know, really critical. That's why we want you guys to really think hard in these sessions, but also take time to relax and connect with everyone, because some of the things I've heard back from people around, it's just so good that I can actually interact and see people. I've been stuck in these Zooms, so where I can't really do that in the same way with so many people at the same time. So yeah, enjoy that experience as well.
Great. Look, and I think this whole discussion, and particularly with you two here still on the stage, it needs to be taken in the context of the incredible growth that has gone on in FireSticks. I mean, you have gone from, you know, like virtually just a volunteer community committee to now having staff. And I know the incredible amount of work that you've been doing, Pete, and with all due respect to the Jess and the rest of the board, and to Ollie as well. I think, you know, like recognition of those things that have happened have been an incredible journey over the last 12 months. And I think that this discussion, which we're going to get into in 1 minute's time, needs to be taken in that context. But take it in this context that yeah, there's been a lot of growth, but it's only the start. And there's still an incredible amount of journey and amount of growth to be had and grown. You heard that vision from Victor and Jess as well on what that looks like into the future. So please use this. We've got an hour for it. Use this hour, as Pete said, just to relax and have a discussion. But think about those key points as they have raised them and the key questions around that. And we'll come back as a group around 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock. Am I right? New South Wales time. So there are those questions there for us to answer. But like I said, just have the time to take that yarn. And before we get into it, is there any remaining points, Pete and Jess, or we just get straight into it?
Let's get into it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so at your table, then you'll see the whiteboards, and if you've got any questions, you're going to have those facilitators coming around to your table. So ask them the questions. Don't ask me. I don't know.
All right, thanks, Matt.
Okay, see you all soon.
See you soon.
Great. So that just gives a little bit of an overview of some of the work that's happening in FireSticks Alliance in Australia around capacity building and training. Who are interested more to learn about what their program development is, to see the Vimeo link. And I know that that's been shared in Whova. We're a little bit ahead of time right now. I don't know if any of the other co-organizers, Amy or Frank Lake or Mary Hoffman, want to add anything at the moment, but I'd invite them to come up and share.
I do have one question that just came up in the Q&A from Gretchen Inbring. She says, thank you for sharing today. For any and all presenters, what are some of the key topics related to Indigenous fire that you think need further research? And what are some of the best practices or suggestions for ways that researchers can explore these topics without unduly burdening the communities we work with, and in some cases are a part of, i.e. how do we avoid research exhaustion?
Great. I don't know, Amy or Frank, do you want to or Mary, I don't know. Does anybody want to take that on? I don't want to take the limelight from anybody.
I'll start as a non-Indigenous person and also a person who's done a little research here and there. I think the answer to that question is just ask them. People will say, well, I have all this energy, I have all this goodwill, and I want to apply the skills that I know. But unless you ask people what are their questions that they're trying to figure out as they work on their fire futures, your skills might not be directed in the right way. So I would say keep in mind a bit of followership, and then a bit of co-creation is another concept. But yeah, ask them.
Yeah, I think, Mary, that's a great point. And just, excuse me, follow up on that. Like in the communities that I'm working with, every nation wants something different. Like some nations are really excited to have researchers come. Others are very frustrated about it. And one of the issues I think that's a constant source of frustration, given this is a fire ecology conference, is, Western scientists who want to come in to prove our knowledge. And I think that that's one thing that can be very difficult for some communities, because like we already know our knowledge, like, we have our elders' stories and the practices that we've learned. So having a Western scientist kind of come in to prove things can be a touchy subject. So I think that you have to be sure, that the community wants that type of work done in their place. And also, even if you're doing physical science on Indigenous territory, it's something too that you should have, like Mary said, have talked to the nations over and other people. And like I go sometimes as far as to say like that in Canada, you need band council resolutions to even be able to do physical science work on territories. So anyways, that's just my thoughts on it. I think Mary's advice is a great though.
Yeah, and I would echo that. I think, it's a really important to begin any conversations and thoughts around working with Indigenous communities by having the conversations with people. And I always make the distinction here locally in California that, you have your tribal councils, you have Indigenous organizations, and then you have the practitioners and the public side of the tribes. The practitioners are probably where you're going to want to be doing the work, but sometimes the agencies or folks doing research are going to want to start with the council, and you may not even get a response because they're not even certain sometimes of who their own citizens are that have the knowledge and who are the knowledge keepers. And so that's a really important point, I think, to start with in terms of like recognizing, well, what level are you reaching at, and then starting to understand how to develop questions and research together, because I think that we all have different thoughts of things that we want to be understanding more, and I can say that even as an Indigenous academic, I get people within the community who use the term, IST and so forth, you're a scientist or whatever, and it's a negative connotation. And even though I'm a traditional cultural practitioner and I would almost rather be known as that than an academic, there's that kind of barrier that's there too. But forming the questions with community and working on the issues that are important to community are really things that we need to be looking at. And I think that some of the things that we probably see as emerging needs are really focused around the effects of climate change. I mean, we've lived through climate change forever, but what's happening right now, I think, is confounded by a lot of different things that Amy brought out and other talks will include, and that is the intergenerational trauma, the loss of knowledge in some communities, and those sorts of things. And so we're trying to piece these things back together and still adapt to the changes that are happening at present. So looking at the effects of climate change and invasive species and things like that in particular are things that I look at, but I think I can only be in so many places. So I think that those are some baseline things that we could all be working on, but ask the questions and develop them with the communities. I know we're running a little bit behind, so I'll probably stop there and introduce myself as the next speaker. Yeah, so to be more, intended to be more conversational. So we can definitely have those conversations going on. I'm going to start screen share and just talk a little bit about some of the work that I'm doing here in California. Actually, I'm trying to make sure I'm on the right screen here for a moment, which is that one. And make sure
That looks great.
you can see it now. Perfect.
Yep.
So the intent of what I wanted to share today is really about some of the progress of things that are happening in California. There's a lot of really great things that are starting to take place across the state. And so, with our panel, we thought it would be good to kind of give an update and maybe some inspiration for folks who are coming in from other places. So in terms of, what's recognized is that we obviously have a lot more attention around Indigenous fire today than what we've had in the past, particularly over the last 2 to 3 years, I would say. We've just had a lot of media interest. There's been a lot more public awareness, and maybe it's because of thinking about environmental justice and social justice issues, particularly here in the US, that are really raising awareness of Indigenous issues. But one of those things in terms of like environmental justice is recognizing the place of Indigenous fire. And over the time that I've kind of been working on this professionally, it's just really amazing to see this change that's beginning to happen. And I don't know if it's for real or if it's just a short-term interest, but it's starting to seem like it's actually a lot more real than just icing on the cake, and being driven by wildfires as an example. So I want to just begin by talking about some of the places where Indigenous fire is happening in California. And when we talk about the cultural application of fire, there's some specific things I think is important to kind of start to distinguish, and maybe Frank and Mary and Amy will talk to this a little bit too. But there's this boundary between what is Indigenous fire and cultural burning, and then what's the difference, say, with a tribal firefighter or somebody who's trained in suppression, or a tribe that has a fire department that does prescribed burning. Like there may be very different objectives of those sorts of things. And so what I'm highlighting in this slide are loci of where those cultural practices of fire are still being applied within the landscape. And most of it's located north, in the northern half of the state of California. And I just give some examples here with the red dots, and I will zoom into that a little bit later. But we've got a lot of different ways in which people are engaging around fire throughout the state, as I've kind of alluded to. I wanted to recognize the role of organizations and kind of drivers. For many years, and thinking back to that previous slide, we've got people in kind of dispersed locations around the state, more rural, frequently, where Indigenous fire has been occurring. Sometimes it's a weaver going out and just tending to a small patch of plants. Sometimes it's a little bit of a larger area, but there's not been a real collective of people working together. And I think Amy's talk really highlights, kind of where people are starting to come together around that sort of thing. And in 2015, the Nature Conservancy, and Mary Hoffman is the leader of this, but started the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network as a collaborative, as a way of trying to bring people together with investment in a particular geographic landscape, where there were diverse partnerships of people working together in the Klamath River region. And from that time period, and the focus of what they were, that group of people who came together to form that focused on around cultural fire revitalization, doing some strategic planning around where and how fire might be used, developing training, and then obviously the emphasis on intergenerational learning. And in that time, since 2015, there's been a lot more interest from other tribes and a lot more opportunities to engage with Indigenous fire within the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network, which includes folks from New Mexico and the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe in Minnesota, and the Klamath tribes in Oregon, and the list goes on. We're growing, and we're starting to see this network grow beyond even what I've got shown on the slide here. I'll say that, we've had a lot of successful actions where tribes and practitioners have been able to put fire back into different landscapes. When I think about the landscapes of California, we've got pretty good representation across a lot of different ecosystems. California is a very diverse place. We've got many different terrestrial vegetation types that are here, and Indigenous peoples' knowledge systems are reflective of those systems and what the fire relationship is to them. And I think from a fire ecology perspective, I'll just say that it's really important to recognize when we think about, say, the differences of wildfire and fire effects and fire return intervals. From a cultural perspective, when we kind of overlay those things, they sometimes aren't exactly the same. And so when we think about one region of California, say Southern California, where a lot of folks will say, oh, we've had too many fires, and the problem of fire in Southern California is too many fires. I look at it as, well, from a cultural perspective, it's not too many fires, it's too many of the wrong kind of fires, the wrong times and things like that. So we've had some good successes of bringing fire back for restorative actions and cultural resources and things like that have been taking place. But then we also have a lot of missed opportunities, and I think through many of the conversations that I have with practitioners across the state is kind of the vision. And since over the last 2 years, I just think about places where I know I've had those conversations with people to talk about where and how we would bring fire back into them. And just as an example here, I've got some pictures from the lightning complex that burned through the coastal areas with the redwoods in 2020, and most recently with this summer, the Caldor fire south of Tahoe, which both of those burned through places where we've been talking and planning around Indigenous burning, at least amongst ourselves, and trying to build that plan to ultimately be able to push it to agencies to support that. And then the fires happened, and so now we're kind of put in a situation where we need to think about how we're going to bring fire back into these places. So that brings about some opportunities that are there for stewarding in places where we haven't been able to put fire, but where wildfires have happened, and how can we re-engage in those landscapes. And then there's just a tremendous amount of restoration work that's taking place across the state. For instance, myself being from the Delta in the San Francisco Bay Delta region, we've got a lot of riparian areas that were destroyed by settlement and agriculture and things like that. And now the state and partners are starting to do restoration work, but those places need to be stewarded. And so those riparian forests are going to need fire. And so we're actually having conversations now where, entities are coming to us to engage around Indigenous stewardship for these places. And so on the lower left, I have a picture, and I'm kind of running the cursor. I don't know if you can see this, but this little river bend here is about 500 acres of restored riparian. And the plan is, at some point to start to bring Indigenous fire back in to maintain it. So in California, we're obviously a very progressive state. We've got a lot of interest in kind of being a leader around climate change and biodiversity and social justice. And one of the things that I think is kind of unique is that in 2019, we have the kind of release of the 4th California Climate Assessment Report, which I was a co-author on. And that 4th Climate Assessment Report was the first that included any perspectives of Indigenous communities in that plan. And like Amy was talking about in her presentation, it's like people working for free. I mean, the state said, hey, we want to include tribes, but they didn't pay any of us to do that work. They just said, well, we'd like to get you all together to write up some things for us. So we, kind of molded over and said, well, I guess it's for a benefit, like, let's go ahead and do that. But the outcomes were really, kind of stating like we need to integrate tribal guidance for resiliency planning and implementation. We need to empower tribes to be able to assert traditional stewardship practices. And we also needed to find ways of creating funding which, you know, carbon offsets were one of the ways that we kind of identified that. So since that time, a lot of other things that have kind of evolved. And, you know, in thinking about the policy level framework in California, we're a unique place in that when the state was founded in 1850, there was never a true like treaties to relinquish our rights to the land. And so the state was formed, but no like legitimate native title was established. And so in reality, California is still indigenous land. It's just occupied by a government, state and federal government that you know, doesn't recognize necessarily our traditional rights. And so in that kind of framework, the law of the land is really something that really we could be using more to kind of assert our right over the stewardship of the landscape, which none of us have really pursued for a variety of reasons, mainly because of just not wanting to upset things and not take action at the right time. But you know, that would be backed by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, where we have the rights to steward for our ancestral territories. And the whole state of California is still, I mean, anybody's landscapes across the world are still ancestral territories, even if they're not occupied. So we have state and federal laws that support recognition of self-determination, and then, you know, within the air quality side of it, we've got policy there to support you know, the desires for Indigenous stewardship. So within the last year, I've had the opportunity to work with a coalition of folks to kind of redirect and frame policy. And one of the products of that was this thing called the Good Fire Report, which was supported by the Crook Tribal Government and the Hewlett Foundation and others. But there were 10 takeaways, and this report not only focuses on Indigenous fire, but also prescribed burning. There were 10 takeaways, you know, the issues for tribes, dealing with air district permitting, CAL FIRE, et cetera, were all that were identified. For tribes, I'll just say that we recognize the rights to steward on Indigenous traditional territories, recognizing the rights of sovereignty, that we shouldn't have to apply for permits from CAL FIRE or the air districts for doing the work that we need to be doing, which is all within the law of the land. We shouldn't have to deal with liability issues, and there should be maybe funding available to support burners who are trying to do the right thing in their ancestral places. We have issues with consistent rapport with agencies, a lot of turnover within agencies, and that's really difficult to deal with. And then this idea of qualifications, like who's qualified to be a burner and that sort of thing. And so, and then air quality regulations were the other side of it. So from that, we really started to work pretty hard with the state in kind of directing some of these things. And at the same time that we're developing this report, the governor of the state releases a report in January of last year called the California Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan, which identifies like 99 different points of things that we want to advance within the state. And it includes the Indigenous communities as part of it. So we have that developing. We also have, out of this action plan, the prescribed fire, cultural fire, and wildfire use strategic plan, which I'll talk about on the next slide. But more importantly, I think we have 2 pieces of legislation that were developed this past year and passed by our legislator and signed by the governor. Senate Bill 332, which addressed liability and identified, like specifically defined what a cultural burner is and a cultural fire practitioner. And that language specifically came from our Good Fire report. And it includes tribal governments, it includes sorry, I'm admitting people to the room at the same time. It includes a variety of different folks, tribal governments, Indigenous led organizations, and traditional cultural practitioners, and it codifies this into law within the state. And AB 642 is where it codifies it into the state laws. And so we've got a lot of engagement that's happening around that. talking about the prescribed fire strategic plan, what it seeks to do is recognize the state and its partners will support and enable the expansion of cultural burning by California Native American tribes, tribal organizations, and cultural fire practitioners across the state. And so there's a lot of work that's going on around that. Specifically, this plan seeks to support tribal sovereignty, invest in cultural burning, includes tribes in planning, and improve co-management type opportunities, but also recognizing the need for doing training. And so that idea of the FireSticks Alliance models from Australia is one of the ways that we're thinking about trying to build that out within the state, which is pretty exciting. In kind of bringing this all together, I want to say and talk a little bit about some of the emerging things that are happening. There's a lot of investment that the state's undergoing currently. That action plan that I just mentioned identified funding. There's already funding that's been put aside to develop and really support Indigenous burning in the state. And I'm currently co-leading a project that loosely has the name Intertribal Indigenous Stewardship Project. And this is co-led by Bill Tripp from the Crook tribe and Mary Adelzada, who is Dene. And we're all working together with a group of folks to kind of steward the development of an organization to support our efforts, which could grow much bigger than what it is. But we've got funding from the Department of Conservation through the state's Forest and Fire Capacity Grant Program and private foundation funds from the Hewlett Foundation and the Resource Legacy Fund to support that. But we began by doing outreach, doing surveys and some findings with traditional cultural practitioners across the state. And what we found is that a lot of people were doing this work on their own. They're working by themselves within community, and most everybody's volunteering. So free work for, you know, the stuff that's happening across the land. There were specific barriers that people were coming up against, and those barriers we actually ended up incorporating into the Good Fire report that I referenced earlier. But among those include access to land, the issues of liability, the qualifications issue, funding of the work that we do, building capacity, racism, invisibility, and then obviously the policy piece. And what we're looking towards is really the development of a future program where people can learn together. People really wanted the opportunity for Indigenous to Indigenous mentorship and learning. So we're trying to find ways of doing that in a way that reflects our cultural needs and also includes youth in that process. So it's intergenerational learning as a way of being able to achieve that. And so there's some synergies that are coming around this. And so that previous map where I showed where fire was happening currently in the state, we've now changed that through our Indigenous Stewardship Project to focus on the ecocultural regions of the state, which we've broken up into roughly 6 different areas based on the geographies of the state and the cultural regions of the state, to kind of show where we're engaged with folks, where we have people steadily engaging with this idea. And one thing that's emerging is that we have this opportunity of building synergies with existing networks. So we've got work up in the Klamath, we've got work in the Lassen foothills, in the region between Tahoe and the Bay Delta, down in the southern Sierras around Yosemite, and then Monterey Bay region, and then a couple of places down south in the southern end of the state, where tribes are trying to revitalize their traditions of fire. And so we've been able to take some of the money that the state is funneling, and we've got an initial investment through the Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program of $1 million that'll be coming forward very shortly, that we will be working to put out for tribes to develop their programs and so forth. But then we've also got additional funding that's put on the table in the tune of about $20 million that the state is making as an investment for tribes to also work on these kind of fire projects and implementation. So there's a lot of different things that are happening within the state, and these are some of the places where I know I'm running short on time, so I'm going to moderate myself on that, but I'll end by just putting my contact information up for folks who want to be in touch. And the Intertribal Fire at thewatershedcenter.com is specifically for the Indigenous Stewardship Project. But I'll stop there and be happy to answer any questions.
Don, it looks like we have a couple of questions that have come in, but I want to make sure we have time for Frank's presentation.
Sure.
And maybe we hold the questions to whatever remains at the end.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, I realize I'm a little bit over, so thanks. And let's go to Frank. And I'll introduce Frank real quick. So Frank Lake is a research scientist with the Pacific Southwest Research Station, and he's based up in Orleans, but he may be out on the coast today. I don't know where Frank's at, but Frank is Karuk, and I've known Frank since our undergrad years and consider him family. So I'm really happy to be able to also co-moderate this with Frank. So thanks.
Great, thank you. I want to know what you're seeing on my desktop or not.
We see the full PowerPoint. If you're able to start the slideshow, it'll go into full screen. There you go.
Okay, so you should see the
Looks
one.
great.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. And again, I appreciate all the work by Dawn and Mary and Amy and others to bring this session together. You know, a lot of times we talk about Indigenous fire stewardship and cultural burning. As you've heard, so much of it is really family-based and that intergenerational responsibility. And so for me, I'm going to use myself a little bit as a case study today to show you how I've been able to do that through the various work of partners and support to be able to conduct burning on my own property, and having that as kind of a case study of sorts to say, this is how I'm getting it done to empower other tribal families and community members in my area of Northwest California. So thank you. You know, really for me, it's part of the teaching from Indigenous philosophies to the operational projects. You know, a lot of it for me, the top pictures from our ceremony, well, actually it's from my older son, brush dance, child healing ceremony at the Karuk Center of the World, Katamine, our village. And then also bringing that forward years later to conducting fire and treks burn, Klamath River treks by the Nature Conservancy support, the Karuk tribe and the Orleans Stones Bar Fire Safe Council coming together. And we really achieved that, you know. And so for us, working together, there's a tribal philosophy that fire is medicine, and for people in the land, and you know, prescribed fire, cultural burning. If you don't have enough fire, then there's the issue of people in the land being sick, and if you have too much fire, like we're seeing now, it can be kind of like a catastrophic overdose. And then, you know, one of the things and the theme that you see across all Indigenous people is that fire is connected to water, and water is sacred, and that's one of the most highest values to consider. So really, this is, you know, embedded in an intergenerational teaching of traditional ecological knowledge that relates to traditional fire knowledge and others and that work. But really for me, it's learning it in the context of my Karuk grandfather, my father, and other community members about the importance of our responsibility and how that relates to food species, regalia species, both ceremonial and subsistence related activities, where Indigenous fire stewardship is at the core of promoting and maintaining that knowledge system and practices. You know, a lot of the work, and I appreciate the synthesis of others, and for this one for Mary, you know, really is that traditional fire knowledge. And for me, being able to have that come through the support. This top picture shows Bill Tripp from the Karuk tribe there, as my son Leland and I conduct after operational briefing on this cultural prescribed burn on our property a couple years back, was to have that in prayer and to use a lightning struck sugar pine piece of kindling as a way of medicine, of connecting lightning, thunder, and spirits to the sugar pine spirit tree as an ignition source to there to be able to have that done with prayer, with intentionality. And then the igniters came along and got the propane torches and drip torches, and then came and lit their off that ceremonial first part. And so really, I think that, you know, kind of the difference as Don and others are addressing, you know, what's the difference between cultural burning and prescribed fire? It's really the intention and the way that you go about it, the broader aspects of it. But for this one, it was very much, you know, teaching my son and then having the others see that and be sharing that responsibility and sharing that day. There's a lot of knowledge to teach in this, you know, at every scale. I learned this model from working with the late Laverne Ferris Glaze with the Karuk Indigenous basket weavers years ago in the Orleans Stones Bar Fire Safe Council, where very much the part of doing hazardous fields reduction around the private and tribal properties along the egress road routes was to enhance the basket material, but it was going to be something she was going to teach. So you have her one grandson igniting and above, and then after 2 years after that fire, coming back and picking a basket stick for their granddaughters. And we see that as a core of teaching all these elements rooted in that cultural practice, even with the burning. So the core of this teaching is that, you know, fire is medicine. So living within fire-prone ecosystems for fire-dependent species, that then over time led to cultural adaptations to be fire dependent cultures. And so, one of the things that comes up is that cultural burning is a form of human services for ecosystems. And it's the evolution of that cultural fire regime that emerged from indigenous adaptations to form the fire dependent cultures. And that really varies through various habitats and ecosystems across an indigenous territory. Also, part of that is how you learn it, recognizing that different members of indigenous community have different types of knowledge and practice for various types of cultural burning. So understanding what their roles and responsibilities are. It also can reflect the differences in whether they're ceremonial or medicine people, related to subsistence, whether they're doing it for food, for basket material, and other purposes. And it also relates to the governance, or kind of often you'll hear indigenous communities talk about the natural laws or creator laws, the ways that govern it, or traditional law that govern why and how you use such fire. And really, when working with indigenous communities, even at the family scale, really that is a range of different types of knowledge systems that are applied just in that one fire operational event or that one cultural burn for your family. Part of it often is understanding the frequency. So a lot of times I think academically there's a colonial perspective of these are natural fire regimes, and that, often intentionally or unintentionally minimize indigenous fire stewardship, but looking at the increased frequency for the use of fire, often more strategically and more frequent than what lightning would actually do on that part of the landscape. Diversifying the seasonality or the times in which you burn, often linked by various indicators that are taught, linked to phenology or the breeding or reproductive times of birds that might be potentially vulnerable at the time that you're burning or not. And then the specificity, what is the objective on that place and time? What is the goal of the family? What are they intending to do? And particularly when it comes into family-based burning, how is that scaled to make sure you're inclusive of all ages, from children to elders? And then that reflects part of that responsibility. And someone who's taught and trained through time, like my kids, are going to be, fire stewards, and they're going to have a responsibility for what they've learned to be able to apply that and help support the community in the broader landscape. Often we hear about historical reasons why tribal people burned. On my property in particular, it increased the crop management, which I'll show you at the end here, related to acorns. It was around pest management, reducing the weevil and the moth that infect it. It also increased deer hunting opportunities, had better acorns, drew in a lot of the wildlife. But there's many more other, and many of those are modern examples or goals that tribe. So it's just not only to recognize the historical context that apply to today, but also, what is a family doing today, like for wildland urban interface, hazardous fuels reduction, improving other aspects of their property or the area that they're going to be managing and stewarding. So we have to, really think about what are some of those historical goals, and linking those to contemporary management. And some of these might be broader things, like my property is a private property nested in a matrix of other jurisdictions around me, Forest Service, other private property, tribal, and how do we bring those together for our contemporary goals, really? And again, thinking at the nature of the family, it's the preservation of the knowledge. It's education that's linked to teaching intergenerationally. It's the food security that comes from gathering to support ceremonies and other families and members of my community. Fire is a form of medicine and the healing of, good food and good health. And then things related to basketry and also economic opportunities that evolve out of that operation and or that process. For me, there's a diversified, the Western Klamath Mountain region is very diverse in its geology and topography and vegetation elevationally. If you look at the picture in the top left, you'll see I have fire history studies that I've conducted, and also ethnographic work looking at linking the villages to the trail systems. And that Golden Heart is right where my home and property is. And in the picture at the bottom of the village, I'm literally across the river from that site and uphill about not even 3/4 to less than a mile away. So in many ways, there's a continuity of responsibility in the nexus of where I live as a Karuk descendant within my tribal community. And, the last part here that really is making it better, I think, and Don talked about, emergent policy, is this aspect of California's recent Senate Bill 332, where this cultural burn means the intentional application of fire to land by tribes, organizations, cultural fire practitioners to achieve those cultural goals and objectives. And for me, that's very much at the core of what has been able to support my family-based burning. And as a cultural fire practitioner, besides my science hat that I wear as an agency research ecologist in the fire and fuels program and actually doing this work, is really more of that responsibility and showing how this can be done and scaled up. But many families need that help. And this doesn't only apply to tribal reservations. So there's also some jurisdictional interpretations of where this applies or not. But in my case, it very much is a tribal descendant applying this to my private property for my cultural goals and family responsibility. And so kind of a layout here. This is kind of an overview of my 5 acres. Again, the heart area is where I'll be featuring my acorn trees, but it's been, multiple work around the house and also tying into what's going on with my adjacent neighbors. Part of this for me has been in the US using the Natural Resource Conservation Service, EQIP, it's an environmental quality incentive program, was the more recent kind of government or federal assistance that I had for cost reimbursement to do the work that I had on my property. So thinking about how do you achieve this, and I struggled with how to articulate this multi-phase process, but the capacity of families is often limited. And so it takes partnership support to do this. Indigenous fire stewardship strategies are multi-stage to achieve the desired condition. And each stage is an evaluation of resource species, that resource of interest. In our case, it would be tan oak acorns at this site, and related to the fuel or the vegetation conditions through each of those iterations. And so each treatment really moves the area towards a desired state. And so if you look at my diagram, starting in the lower right-hand corner, TXT is the treatment 1. That was the initial one that was done through the Fire Safe Council to just even get in there and thin around. And then we had pile burning. And then eventually at some point in June 2013, we had a research burn. So that was our kind of first prescribed fire. And then after that burn, I went to the treatment 3 where I had to come in and clean up the stuff that was fire thinned. And again, each time promoting those larger legacy trees that are part of this orchard. It's a historical orchard that I've now assumed responsibility for on my private property. But ultimately, I nudge us from the lower right-hand corner of less resistance and dense overstand, low resource quality, to promoting it up to the top left to where I have high resistance and good cultural use quality. And within that band, I get the desired tree and understory vegetation that reflects the culturally desired species within that habitat and for those resources. And that at that point, through the partnership, really gets me to that point of having that ability for Indigenous fire stewardship and for the cultural burning that now I can do with my family. I'm not needing to have a very complex burn. I don't need to have a bunch of holding personnel. The fuel loading is light. It's just the leaf litter. And then, my kids can come in there and do that. It's very different from the first time we applied fire at the very same place, but this has been done over about 12, 15 years. So 10 to 12 years. So, I'm just going to end here a little bit. I do speak fast and I cover a lot of material, but, this was how it started. It started from my grandfather teaching me on the far left there through subsistence like acorns and huckleberries, being taken to sacred places, prayer sites, talking about fire medicine, spiritual responsibility, being raised with that. Then having that knowledge transferred to my son and other people like Bill Tripp and elders in the community, investing that knowledge in me or even my kids. I'm one of the few, I think, that, even for the Klamath River Trex burns this year on Indigenous Peoples Day, my kids came out to the burn. My daughter got to ride around in the fire truck. She got to see more of the unit burning it than I did. Well, my son Leland and I got to watch them ignite it, but we weren't able to quite participate in that burn, but we were there to observe and teach. And so from that, it goes to that second fire treatment here for the Klamath River Trex, where I have Rick O'Rourke from the Cultural Fire Management Council there by the fire truck burning. And the other one in the middle is Herman Albers with the Karuk Fire Crew. So I have Indigenous igniters burning on my property. At the same time, and I didn't include this picture, but it was on my opening slide, you have the burn boss Jim Wills walking down the fire line with my son Leland hand in hand, talking about how they're caring for the acorn trees. The year after, my Yurok cousin Chris Peters came over. We gathered high quality acorns. And that year after the drought, those were some of the best quality acorns that went to the Yurok and other ceremonies to feed our people. And then we got another burn a year after that in October 2017, still pretty good acorn quality. And then we have a follow-up burn in 2019. You can see it, the same trees, same place, getting a lot better. And then this right here in this October, after I was able to apply fire again, the same trees in the same background, it's getting better. And when I have elders come here to gather, they say this is getting to be the ideal condition. This is like the gold standard. And so the ability to have my family come and gather here, have our kids involved, it's a way of promoting that responsibility, but you also have a gold standard of what's the best quality resources. But it wasn't possible by myself. I really have to thank the Mid-Klamath Watershed Council, which oversees the Orleans Somes Bar Fire Safe Council, the Karuk Tribe, the Nature Conservancy, both through Trex and Mary with the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network, because it was all these reiterations that helped this year give high quality acorns, a more resistant and resilient property, and making that overall for my place and my family much more secure and much more the beneficiaries of this work. And from here on out, we only can expand to other places, working over the fence of my neighbors, continuing to do that, and then also showing and being able to empower other tribal families in our area through this kind of at least one model that I'm sharing here. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. And I think we've got time for maybe a few questions before our morning half of the session ends. I think that was great. And I think it's great that you started out that slide with Jim Wills, because later this afternoon, I'll be out burning with him on our ecological reserve. One question that showed up, and I'm just trying to follow through in the chat here. It seems like to create cultural practices, there needs to be a deeper purpose in preventing fires that threaten communities. Can we create cultural burning practices within Western culture without cultural practices of gathering foods and medicines? And I think that you have maybe some good insights on that.
So how can we promote cultural burning? So, for me, off this property, ideally it would be an area through the partnership like the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership and the Forest Service and the tribe and the Mid-Klamath Watershed Council, designing the treatments that are adjacent to the private property. And then that way we can have a similar fuel load continuity desired condition. I mean, this ancient Karuk orchard for these acorns extends across this whole big flat. And so it goes from mine to my neighbors to the Forest Service. And traditionally that's how it was managed. It wasn't managed at the half-acre piece I'm burning now. It was managed at the 15, 20 acre scale. And so that in itself is the positive aspect that I see. Also, I think as you have forest plan revisions and the land resource management plans incorporate, and you see a lot more policy coming out from the US about working with indigenous people, particularly tribes, on co-governance and co-management, is that opportunity to then have areas designated as tribal stewardship areas in which families can hopefully, in the future, you got to have this vision to be able to come back in there and revive their ancestral gathering places that are now on federal lands. And I know that's the model that a lot of tribal communities or indigenous communities are seeking, is to reclaim that place where their great grandparents had or intergenerationally had been at, and reviving that and reaffirming that responsibility and tie to their ancestral place.
Great, thanks, Frank. And I think we're out of time, but I just want to remind folks that we do have another half of this session that'll pick up at the next hour, and then we've also got a fire circle that we're running tomorrow. And I think Sam's gonna step in to share some other news with us.
Yes, thank you, Frank. Thank you, Don. I want to thank all of our speakers for sharing your expertise with us today. Recordings of this session will be available in the next 2 weeks here in Hoover, so you can come back anytime to visit. Up next, we have 2 general sessions, 4 special sessions, and 2 fire circle discussion sessions. One of your options is to continue this discussion with another great panel of speakers assembled by Don and Mary, which will also offer Spanish and Portuguese in the session titled Advances and Challenges of Indigenous Fire Stewardship. Thank you again to all of our speakers. Enjoy the rest of the day. And Don and Mary, I'll see you momentarily in the next session. Thanks all.